Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Ali Wolf and I, Tim Sullivan, welcome you back to the housing market update way back when we called it the COVID market update, but thank goodness we've kind of worked through that. We are today set up to talk about a whole bunch of things. I'll get into that in just a second, but know that we will send you the recording after this. And please, while we're here, submit questions because we absolutely pay attention to them, and to the ones we can address today, we will. Otherwise, it helps us get to the place of future content. And I want to make sure that you know this world right now is somewhat uncertain. And the side of the house that I oversee, our advisory team, is really busy in a whole series of places. We're in the build to rent space, but not just single family rental. Also in the cottage product, we're helping builders reposition to find that price discovery. You'll hear Ali talk about that today. Our multifamily practice led by Kimberly Byram is exceptionally busy in a wide variety of markets. And then of course, we're doing some land bank work and M&A. Even with the market the way it is, there's some M&A efforts going. So want to make sure you are aware of that, and we are moving and grooving. Part of what we were improving is our database, and Enterprise 2.0 has three really important new additions: the master plan community profiles, which you can access directly. We have the top 100 CBSA market reports, which are chock full of really good information, and integrated access to the classic database within New Home Trends. So check out zonda.home/enterprise and you can see what we're doing. Now, there's something pretty exciting going on, not just with our data and not just with what we're doing related to all of our information, but we now have our Zonda Virtual going, which is virtual reality and will help you with 3D photorealistic home renderings. But there's another connection here that's really important. And I want to make sure that you know that, last year Zonda updated and acquired BuzzBuzz Home. And BuzzBuzz Home, we've now renamed Livable, but I want to make sure you know it started as a platform in Canada. And with this rebranding, we're launching in the US and Canada this spring. And Livable is focused exclusively on the new home construction side of the world. And so very important, it's free to list for all builders. And the listing platform will leverage Zonda Virtual's engagement solutions. That's the last slide I just shared with you. And it'll engage our editorial and proprietary real-time market data. And with that, you get the most accurate and approachable, engaging home buying experience. So we're trying to help the entire process, soup to nuts, with research and the process of home buying. Get the free listing before we launch in the coming months. Reach out to Karen Bonder or any of our other teammates, and we will get you guys introduced and understood to what we're planning. And speaking of plans, here's just a few of the upcoming events that we have. Look very quickly for maybe your market. We've got Deal Makers coming up, MFE Leadership, our Build to Rent, Future Place. And these are just some of the factors we'll be presenting along, of course, with our local frame markets. Very excited about that. And speaking of excited, we want to acknowledge that we have a pretty terrific sponsor today. And I want to let you know that Triad has been stepping in, and as I've gotten to know their team, they really have some cool things happening. First of all, their wall panel equipment helps builders for multi or single family, and it helps increase production with bottom line results, primarily because they're so quick to deliver. And in a tight labor market, they offer equipment for framing and wall panels, sheathing wall panels, floor deck, ceiling, subcomponent system, stair manufacturing. I actually got on the website yesterday, and there's some really cool stuff that helps you get this offsite manufacturing and panelization. And the Triad engineers are building solutions so customers save labor, reduce headcount, and remember, they're really, really quick. Now, Triad has the fastest lead times in the industry. We couldn't say if it wasn't true. And a parts and service department that's second to none to keep your increased production humming along. They're entering their 7th continuous decade, helping builders make the American dream come true. Please, please, please give Triad a call at 800-568-7423, extension 133, or do what I did and just get on www.triadmachines.com. So thank you for the team there. We appreciate it greatly. And we will move on. Once again, thank you, Triad. The next thing that we're going to get to together is going to be about our agenda. And today's agenda has a really important factor to it. In fact, if you can go back a slide, let's go back to the agenda. There we go, backwards. Let's go a little bit more. The key thing today is that Allie and I will split it like we always do. She'll do the first 5 sections, I'll do the last 2. But I want to make sure that you're aware of what Allie's been doing this last year that is all culminating in what we're going to talk about today. In this last year, over 12 months, Allie completed 115 speeches in about 22 different states. And you know she's our chief economist, and you know her economic background. But the single most important thing that I'm learning about Allie now is her flexibility and steadfastness. And I say that because she was in San Antonio last week, traveling to a big presentation, and there was a gas leak in the hotel that she was in. She was locked out of her hotel room, didn't have access to any of her belongings or clothes. Thank goodness she had her computer with her. And as always, the show went on. I mention this only because I always talk about Allie's sharp brain, incredible team on the economics department, and all the terrific research she does. But she's also pretty flexible and pretty tough. That's my message to you today. And it kind of ties into what she's going to talk about. Last time we got together, I warned you that Allie was going to have news that wasn't necessarily positive. Today, there's a little bit more green shoot, a little bit more positive, but we are not out of the woods yet. That's my setup for you, Allie. Allie, if you would, please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. And speaking of flexibility, everyone bear with me for a second. I know that there's a big box that is making up the screen, and I'm going to just try to reset things to see if I can get rid of that really fast. I can. Fantastic. So let me just get this set up. Tim, as you know, something always goes wrong. So we are now back in business, and thank you for the introduction. The gas leak was scary, but at least it happened during the day. I am so thankful it didn't happen overnight. Anyways, hello, everyone. Welcome to our 37th webinar in this series. We are so pleased that you joined us to discuss the current economic and housing trends. Now, I want to start today's presentation by acknowledging the fact that we're meeting today in a different month with really the same backdrop. And the backdrop is what we're seeing with inflation. Now, as we look at the inflation reports, we have seen some improvement on both the year-over-year trends and on the month-over-month. Month-over-month is showing that we're not continuing to see this steady increase, at least to the same pace that we've been seeing in overall inflation. When you look at year-over-year, both the producer price index and the CPI are still up between about 5.5 and 6.5 compared to last year. So we're operating well above where we should be at an average of about 2. And if you look at how the Federal Reserve is interpreting this, you're seeing from Jerome Powell, he's saying that, we're seeing this welcome reduction in the monthly pace, but it will take substantially more evidence to give confidence that inflation is on a sustained path downward. Put another way, we should continue to expect to see a couple short-term rate increases this year, because while we're seeing some improvement, the job, similar to what Tim said, the job is not done. If you remember back in the 1970s, Congress gave the Federal Reserve their dual mandate. One of the categories was to have maximum employment. A 3.5% unemployment rate, 5% wage growth, still a lot of job openings, supports that idea that, okay, check, maximum employment is underway. But that price stability, as we meet here again, and I was looking at presentations that I did last January, and this section on inflation is actually not very different to what we were presenting even a year ago. Price stability, not there. And so what the Federal Reserve has said is we're going to continue this war on inflation. We've already seen at this point 7 short-term rate increases. That is the federal funds rate, and you can see the chart here. It shows that we're just over 4%. If you listen to what the Fed officials are saying, not just Jerome Powell, but some of the others like James Bullard, he's saying that where we are right now, we are not at a point that the federal funds rate is sufficiently restrictive, but they believe it's getting closer, meaning they are not thinking that they're done raising short-term interest rates. And what it seems like is we will get maybe 2 to 3 more this year, no longer to the tune of 75 basis points, probably 50 or 25 basis points, putting us somewhere between 5 and 5.25 for where we'll see those rates get to and then hold. If you look at where that is, that's the red dotted line showing where we might go. You can look back to the mid 2000s. That's about the high level, the high watermark that we got to then as well. What the Federal Reserve wants to see now is once we get up, once we do a couple more of those short-term rate increases, we want to pause. Because what happens is the Fed is raising rates. It takes a while for those higher rates to filter into the economy. It takes even more time for those changes in the economy to show up in data, which is why there's still a lot of talk about could the Federal Reserve accidentally overdo it? Because they're trying to make decisions on lagged economic trends and even more lagged economic data. But I think your takeaway is a few more short-term rate increases this year, but also trying to track how the economy progresses throughout that. Because one of the factors that the Federal Reserve would be looking at is, well, what's happening with consumer spending? If you think back to consumers, know that they represent 70% of the overall economy. This is such a core part that we need to be tracking to see how consumers are behaving. There's a lot of ways to track consumer spending. We'll talk about what that looks like in the housing market. But this morning, we got a new release on retail sales. Retail sales is just what you would imagine, people going out spending money in retail locations. Month over month, again, seeing a deceleration in the data, which is what the Federal Reserve wants to see. Year over year, still up 5.2% compared to last year. And that's above our historical average going back to the year 2000. So you can see the trend is that we're seeing some rolling over in this data, but consumer spending is still holding up. It's holding up from retail sales. It's holding up when you look at both the goods and service sectors of the economy. Now, here what you're looking at is that the service part of the economy is continuing to grow. And some of this is still some of the pent-up demand that we accumulated during the pandemic. And then you can see that goods are starting to flatten out. But if you look at where they are compared to where we're coming from in January of 2020, goods still up 16% from pre-pandemic levels, services up 4%. Again, why this matters is you're not really seeing that spending is rolling over in the way that the Federal Reserve would imagine when they're trying to slow the economy. Now, part of the reason we're continuing to see this strength is that if you remember when Tim and I were meeting with you guys over the past few years, we were talking about how there was excess savings. Now, there are some economists that estimate that was between $2 trillion and $2.4 trillion. What do we mean by excess savings? Well, remember, when the pandemic hit, we had stimulus from the federal government, we had student loan forbearance, we had lifestyle changes. Each of these things allowed savings to increase. Now, over the past few years, we've been burning through some of that savings to now the point of the excess savings is somewhere between 1.2 and 1.8 trillion. Why you care about this is as we're looking at the excess savings coming down, JP Morgan Chase's team says that if we continue to see relatively high levels of inflation, and if we continue to see relatively high levels of consumer spending, all of this excess savings is completely depleted out of the system by the middle to the end of 2023. So they're saying we're burning through that savings. And what's happening is we're not replenishing our savings to the same extent. So again, pandemic hit, we had this record high number of 33.8% savings rate. How much of your income is saved? We're now at a record low, 2.4%, where the historical average is 6.1. So burning through some of that savings, know that lower income individuals, middle class generally, are finding that the inflation has worked through some of that savings. Usually that savings is now concentrated in our higher wealth individuals right now. Okay, so savings is coming down. We're not replenishing it, but we still have high inflation and we still have consumer spending. So what's fueling that? Well, the answer is right now, consumers are spending differently. When you look at total credit card debt, let's go back in time to then talk about where we are. In 2019, we had gotten to this new high with total credit card debt. We were tracking the trends. We were saying, okay, looks like consumers are really starting to take on some debt in that market. Pandemic hit, increased savings, people were paying off their credit card balances. You see that with that spike in 2019, and then you see that dramatic drop off. When you look at where we are today, I'll show the graph update in a second, but we've seen this rapid increase in credit card balances where the Federal Reserve Bank of New York shows that we've had the largest year-over-year increase in credit card balances in more than 20 years of 15%. No, again, you're coming from a low base, so that's going to make a larger percent. But as we're looking at this, you can see that those balances have shot up, putting us right in line with where we were back in 2019. Now, this number to me is we need to watch this because it is showing that consumers are starting to spend differently, but I have a couple caveats with it. One is if you look at total debt and you adjust it for inflation, you're actually finding we're still down about 5% compared to where we were in the mid 2000s. And I think more importantly, if you look at the delinquency level for credit cards, you're finding that we're actually rolling down instead of increasing. So delinquencies are really a non-issue at this point. But the reason I bring this up is we're seeing the changing in the spending habits. For now, everything looks okay, looks reasonable, but we also need to track how the economy progresses. And this is something where I apologize if we sound like a broken record, but we're watching the economy so closely, especially as it relates to a broader economic recession, in our opinion, meaning broader job losses than just the few sectors that we're seeing them right now. When you look at a recession, I think the good news is there's more conversations about, is the Federal Reserve able to pull off a soft landing, a little bit of enthusiasm around that. But if you look at the World Bank, if you look at the International Monetary Fund, if you look at the banks, their CEOs, and if you just look at CEOs in general, most are still expecting that we see a recession this year. The recession is generally assumed to be mild and generally assumed to be short, at least based on what we're seeing. But this backs up what our belief at Zonda is that we do think we'll probably still see that run-of-the-mill recession as we go into the balance of this year, starting sometimes later. I think we're not there yet, at least in terms of how the job losses are looking. Now, as we look at this, and I'm going to go full circle at the end of my segment of this presentation, tying back what we are expecting to see with the labor market to what we should be tracking for the housing market. But I want to go into some of the housing trends that we're seeing in our data. And I think the first thing is it's weird to be meeting with you guys and celebrating a 6% interest rate, but it seems that sentiment has really breathed a sigh of relief that we went from 3% interest rates to 7%, and now we're back down to 6%. And as Tim will go through a section, he'll talk about the buy downs and how buy downs can get you pretty low in today's market, at least seeing those rates moving down. Doesn't change the fact that that monthly payment has still gone up considerably compared to where we were last year, 30 to 60%, depending on the market and depending on how much home price appreciation we're seeing right now. And as we look at what this means for purchasing power, if you go from a 3% interest rate to 6%, you're seeing what that means if someone cannot change their budget of what kind of house they're looking at. And I know from being across different housing markets and visiting with sales associates, consumers are having to reset their expectations. Maybe they thought they could buy a $500,000 home when interest rates were 3%, but maybe the market was too competitive and they weren't able to secure a home. Well, now they're looking at something that's maybe $360,000, and that feels different and that feels disappointing, and it feels frustrating that you're paying more money for a lesser home. And I think that's something that we're going to have to take some time getting through. And we know from a builder point of view, there are some incentives to help with the mindset of that. But as we're looking at that math, and you ask about what is happening in the market, I think the clear response is that buyers are pulling back. Just if you're looking at that decrease in purchasing power, you're going to have some consumers that say, doesn't matter, I still want to buy. You're going to say some that say, you know what, it doesn't make sense right now. And we're finding for existing home sales, remember that's the largest part of the overall market, our total sales level on a seasonally adjusted annual rate is at the same point it was for May of 2020. If you remove that from the data set, we're back to November of 2010 levels. If you look at the new home market, this comes from our database in Zonda. We don't have 2010 levels, we have 2016, where sales activity has certainly pulled back, down a little over 30% year over year, going right in line with those 2016 levels. Now, as we look at this, though, I think one of the questions that we put in the marketing material is, are we still seeing that difference between the eastern part of the US and the western part? And I'm calling in today from Tampa. And if you look on the right-hand side of this chart, you'll find that places like Tampa, Jacksonville, Miami, still that concentration in the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Northeast, that all things considered are holding up stronger than what we're finding in other parts of the country. Now, what this is showing you, most of you are familiar with it, is the average sales rate per month per community. It's our way to look at how are sales looking if you adjust for inventory, and we're comparing to 2019 as what we deem to be a more healthy, a more normal housing market. If you look on the left-hand side, Phoenix, Denver, Vegas, Sacramento, Riverside, these are some of the markets we've talked a lot about over the past few months as ones that slowed the most dramatically and slowed the most quickly. Going to Tim's points about green shoots, for some of these markets, they were in a free fall when we really didn't understand when the market was going to stop dropping. And it seems for many of these markets, we have hit bottom. And it's not a snap back where everything's fine, but it's that there's starting to be a little bit more traffic and consumers are starting to respond a little bit better to the kind of deals that they're finding on the ground. Which is where I want to take the discussion. So as we look at the market overall, we're really saying we're still in this impasse with some signs of it thawing in some markets. Now, what do we mean? Put a different way, we still think we're in the middle of both a buyer's strike and a seller's strike. And I wanted to talk through some of the factors that are behind that. And I think these become interesting to say, well, of these factors, which can be marketed against, which can say, I know that this is your concern, but, and we're thinking through which of these can ultimately change and help the market turn around. Many of you guys have heard Tim and I talk about that shift from fear of missing out to fear of buying at the top, FOMO to FOBAT. And if you think about that, there's really no surprise why people feel uncomfortable. Not only are there scars from the great financial crisis, but if you think about the Federal Reserve, they've straight up said the word bubble in relationship to the housing market. So consumers are hearing from our policymakers that housing isn't a bubble. And while their sector of the economy may not be impacted, just this morning, I'm sure a lot of you saw the Microsoft layoffs. They're just hearing about layoffs, they're hearing about recessions, and they're really asking themselves, do I want to make the largest purchase of my life right now? Especially when rent versus own is now tilting more towards rent with those higher rates. And why do I want to reset my interest rate? Why do I want to take on a higher interest rate at a higher price and maybe have a lesser quality home? I think the buyer strike, in my opinion, makes a lot of sense. But it's not just buyers. You're also seeing that sellers strike. So let's look at active listings. And I think the encouraging thing from the active listings is that if you look at the mint line, that's 2022, and you look at 2022 in relation to 2017, 18, 19, towards the middle of the year, we started to follow that seasonal pattern. We started to get back into a little bit more predictability related to active listings. But we're still extremely below where we were pre-pandemic, finally above 20 and 2021 levels, but we're not at a point that the market has fully returned to balance, at least in most metros. So here what you're looking at is the active listing count, again, compared to 2019. Some places, Minneapolis, Miami, stand out as having the most dramatic drop relative to that point. If you look at somewhere like Phoenix, Austin, Vegas, there's a handful of other markets where active listings are now above 2019. What it's telling you, and as you go back to the buyer strike and the seller strike, I think the buyer strike is less severe in the Southeast, and the seller strike is less severe in the Southwest. So you are seeing that this will depend on where you are. But when you think about the seller strike, you also have to put yourself in their shoes. And very similar to what we're seeing with buyers, that lock-in effect still comes into play. Oftentimes, the person also needs to sell their home, and do they want to reset that rate? Which is why we're seeing more people that are looking at holding a home as a rental. So the idea that, okay, I have this low rate, I'm going to convert this into a rental, and because I've built up some wealth or I have some equity, I want to buy another home. That pulls from the supply pool without adding to it. So that's one component that's playing into the seller strike that I think will be fairly difficult to overcome. But one that's interesting is if you look at some of the data from the brokerage firms last year, we saw that delistings were close to the highest level, where people tried to sell their home, they put it on the market, and maybe it didn't sell as quickly as they wanted, or maybe they weren't getting offers at the price that they wanted. So they chose to take their home off the market. In doing so, none of us know the answer, but the question is, are those people waiting for a stronger time in the housing market when we all know traditionally spring selling season would be that? And one of the big things that I'm watching over the next, I'd say, really kind of 6 to 8 weeks is what happens with those listings. Do we see some of those delisted sellers start to bring their homes to the market? But then here's the question. Knowing that it will vary on where you are, how do we ultimately break the impasse? And we're already starting to see, again, going back to Tim saying some of the green shoots, you're already starting to see that rates going from 7 to 6 plus rate buy downs plus price cuts are actually enticing consumers to come back into the market. And I think what's really important, and to put yourself in the buyer's shoes, is there needs to be a perception of a deal. If fear of buying at the top, FOBAT, is persistent in the market, and if it's part of the consumer's thought process as they're going to buy, perception of a deal helps them get over that. Another key component that I think we need to watch is what happens with dry powder. And I'm using this as a way to say, we know that there are investors that are sitting on the sidelines. Tim is going to provide data later in this presentation about primary buyers that are sitting on the sidelines. And ultimately, there is a point where either confidence comes back in line or affordability comes back in line that these consumers are enticed back in. But you also have to watch for motivated sellers, whether that's people selling for an economic reason, and that's related to job losses. We don't think as dramatic as what we saw last cycle, but we think there will be some buyers, some sellers that are in that place. Plus investors, iBuyers, flippers, and builders. Now, builders become this interesting discussion because if you think about an existing homeowner selling their home, there's probably some emotional attachment, or my Zestimate says my home is worth this. I don't want to sell for less than that. And consumers will say, but this is our family home and it's worth so much more. So I think that will cause people in the existing home market to make different decisions than builders who are in the business of building homes and selling homes. And as we look at the market right now, what we're finding is new home inventory as a share of total inventory has increased to a historic high. Over 30% of the inventory on the ground right now is from the new home market. And this goes to the discussion of what happens with motivated sellers. Well, the reason we would have some motivated sellers is because what we've talked about before, quick move-ins, homes that are likely to be moved into within 90 days, are now up 52% compared to where we were in 2019. Most markets above 2019 levels, most markets above their historic months of supply as well. Now, again, this was very intentional to build these quick move-ins. It's just kind of tricky timing with consumers pulling back. And I was just touring the market last week and we were going to different communities. And what we found was signs outside of many of these new home communities listing how many quick move-ins they have, what kind of incentive is out there, plus what kind of price drop. And that's why I think the motivated sellers becomes a really important discussion point in how the market progresses. Going back to what breaks the impasse though, what about buyers that are not interest rate sensitive? Wealthy buyers. You have relocation buyers. You have 42% of people that own a home that own it free and clear. This is from US Census data. It is surprisingly high to me, but not surprising when you look at the distribution, where it's those that are 55 plus are having more homes that do not have a mortgage. They're not going to have the same kind of interest rate sensitivity as some other potential shoppers. And I think my big question to this, and I know Molly Carmichael is doing consumer research at our company, is what then becomes a compelling or interesting product to someone that is sitting on their home free and clear? They probably have some equity with that as well. What's going to entice them to want to move? Now, as I move to my final section before I pass it to Tim, at least the way that I'm perceiving how the market goes is this really becomes the year of price discovery, where as we're tracking what happens with sales and we're finding some of that price elasticity, I think that's going to force the market to try to figure out where is the right balance between what sellers are willing to sell for and what buyers are willing to buy for. And what I want to start this section with is showing the results that we have from our annual millennial survey. This was conducted in we'll talk about it a little bit later as well. This was conducted just a couple weeks ago, and we have millennials across the country. One of the questions that I like to ask is, if you are not already a homeowner and you're renting, why are you renting? Because we know from our surveys that fewer than 5% of millennials want to rent forever. Most ultimately at some point want to become a homeowner. And when we look at this, I want to go 3, 2, 1. The third reason why people are renting is I can't afford in general. Second reason, I can't afford in the location I like. The first reason is I'm waiting for home prices to come down. That is over 55% of our respondents that said that, collected again 2 weeks ago, when last year it was 5% of the respondents. There is a lot of hope for a market correction. A lot of people saying, if prices just come down, or if we just get to a point that I feel like I'm not making a bad decision by buying right now, then I'm willing to go through with the purchase. Now, is that going to happen? Where the market is going depends absolutely on who you talk to. I thank Fortune for putting together this list of so many companies that you guys all know and love, whether it's CoreLogic, whether it's Morgan Stanley, us here at Zonda. Everyone sent in what they thought would happen to prices this year compared to last year. What you're seeing on this, if you look over to the left-hand side, the dotted line is giving you that 0% mark. 5% of economists expect that prices will be flat to up as we go throughout this year compared to last year. The majority of economists, our department as well, are showing that we expect that prices will be down when you look at 2023 compared to 2022. So that's how economists are viewing what happens as we go through this year. What about builders? Well, again, from our builder survey, we have 76% of builders that anticipate lower prices in 2023 compared to 2022. You can look at the distribution. We have about 40% that are expecting prices to go down 5 to 10% this year compared to last. But this also varies by regions. You can take a look and see how the different regions results come up. But what I'll say stood out the most to me was the Southeast, which we've again talked about as one of the outperforming regions. Slower, it's not as hot as it was, but seeing that downshift, but not as bad. If you look at the Southeast, still the top answer is that prices will likely go down 5 to 10% this year. But look at the second highest answer, flatten. That's an anomaly compared to other markets where there is just a little bit more enthusiasm that prices are a little bit flatter or go down, but not as high as in some other areas. Now, as we look at that and we say, okay, well, what's actually happening on the ground? What we're seeing is we're not needing to wait for prices to come down. We're already finding that peak pricing is behind us in most markets across the country. Now, this is looking at average detached list price of new homes from our Zonda database. Know that this data is subject to what is available in the market. So this will be influenced by mix shift of what kind of product is on the market. Tim, I suspect these colors are not very good if you're colorblind, so I apologize. Let me just give you the high-level takeaway if you can't tell. On the western part of the US, you're finding more markets that have a more dramatic drop in terms of where prices are today compared to peak. You're seeing that also in the Midwest and the Southeast, just other markets where if the color is mint, it's telling you that it's in line with the peak. So it actually hasn't gotten to the point where prices have come down. But as I look at this, and anyone that knows finance knows that I'm not using this phrase entirely correctly, but I think it's a good way to describe how we're viewing the market, which is basically trying to find out where is the strike price? Where is the price that if we see prices come down a certain amount or incentives go up a certain amount or the monthly payment hit a certain level, when do we see those consumers reemerge? And it seems like at least from the early indications in January this year so far, the market is still softer than where it was, but it seems like there's just a little bit more interest as the consumers are seeing that that perception of a deal is out there. So what are we watching? We get this all the time. What are the key things that we're watching for the shifts in the market? And I think number one, and I always mention it, is the 10-year treasury. Track it daily basis, especially if you have someone that you're working with or a friend that's looking at when should they lock their rate. It's a really good indication of real time where mortgage rates are. Remember to add the spread about 2.5 in today's market, add to that, but it is a good indicator of direction of rates. I want to pause here on the third point, which is job growth or losses. What I noticed when talking to some industry professionals recently is because we are seeing some of those signs of life. It's like, okay, game over. Market is coming back. Everything's good. We don't really have anything to worry about anymore. We just got to refine the market. I would say just remember that what we've gone through over the past, let's say 9 months, happened with an overall. Oh no, my Siri's listening to me. Okay. What we've seen. I'm not sure I understand. Not again. Okay, so what we're seeing is that there's just a little bit of confidence related to the fact that the housing market is starting to show signs of life. And just be aware that what's happening is we could see those job losses related to the change in the market. And then finally, Tim, as I pass it off to you, I'll give you a proper introduction in a second, is also just track the traffic. I think that's one of the early signs that looks good because at least consumers are out shopping. And when I was touring the market last week, when I talked to sales agents, they were basically saying what they're seeing on the ground is consumers are going to basically every single community within their price point, finding out what discounts available, finding out what's incentives available. And then once they've done their research, then they know where they ultimately want to end up. So with that, Tim, I know we're running tight on time and I apologize, but let me reintroduce Tim Sullivan to all of you guys. He is our Senior Managing Principal of Advisory, and Tim oversees our entire custom market study business. Now that business ranges from the built to rent market to master plan research and feasibility studies. And I think for those of you that don't know Tim, he spends his days either meeting with clients or traveling around the country or reviewing some of our studies. He is so into the weeds of our industry, and Tim is able to connect the dots in a way that most people are not able to by layering in the information he's hearing on the ground with his 30 plus years of experience and Zonda's proprietary data. Tim is a true market expert in this space, and I am pleased to pass it on to him.
And in my defense, Ali, I do have difficulty with greens and reds, but I'm not colorblind. Look at the upper right corner at the Triad logo. It's red with a little black around the edge. It's beautiful. So, Ali, a couple quick things. We had a question from Jim that I think is an interesting one, and it's really policy related. And the question was something along the lines like this. You know, the Fed is always talking about a 2% inflation rate. That's their target. Do you see any case that they'll get real and possibly move that benchmark to 3, 3.5, 4? What do you think?
They've already changed, because if you guys remember, we came from a place where they said 2, and then they've changed and they've said an average of 2. And then I think if we do not see an improvement, I think they may adjust that to maybe an average of 3. But know that the base effect is going to start working in inflation's favor, where we're going to be growing from a higher level at a slower rate. And so the inflation rate may come down to a point that they don't have to, but I think they'll have to adjust at times if it seems like we're not getting back to an average of 2 at any point.
10-4, understood. That is great. And then you made a very important point about us dropping 30-year fixed mortgages from 7 to 6%, and it kind of brought a little bit of juice into the market. Do you see a case for us being able to get to 30-year fixed at 5% this year? And if so, what does it take?
Tim, why do you do this to me? You know, I don't like answering this question,
but
because
I want the answer.
Okay, so real quick, when you look at the 10-year, I'm pulling it up. I looked at it this morning, but we are at, let's see, I think it was 2.3. So we're at 2.387 right now, which is getting you pretty close to a high 5 for the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. With buy downs, absolutely. If we see the spread start to narrow, the spread between the 10-year and the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, yes, you could also see 5s. Wild card becomes if any economic data comes in that does not follow what we think it should be following, that's when you have a shock to the upside. Otherwise, if inflation continues to come down as expected, you could see interest rates in the high 5s.
Thank you for that. Last thing, and I'll answer this one. Tom reached out and just said, hey guys, have you seen a reduction in material costs or labor costs yet? Absolutely, material costs for sure. Lumber, steel and everything else is a little bit less moving. It's softened less. On the labor side, it has been all over the board. We've talked to some builders who have had some of their labor contractors come back to us and make very, very good deals. So Tom, I think that is starting to shift right now. All right, Ali, we're going to move on. This is Heard on the Street. And ladies and gentlemen, you know, this is always the 5 or 6 point summary of what we're hearing from the builders that we talk to. We're interviewing, you know, a couple hundred every month. It represents almost 25% of all new home sales. Notice a couple key phrases here. Positive traffic signs. We've got market success, but it's very regional and it's kind of weak. Starts are slowing quickly. The resale market, new home space are getting tighter. And there's lingering concerns about the job losses in the economy. And we're in the early innings of that. And Ali and I are tracking that closely. Now, I asked you about lower rates, Ali, but here's the key thing. With the lower rates, we're asking the builders, have you seen any positive response from consumers? And you can see where they're answering. It's too soon to tell. That's almost half of the respondents. But notice 36% are saying no. Now, left-hand side are some of the responses they've given to us. It's really that most builders, if I'm going to be unfair and summarize it, most builders are saying customers are still on the fence for the wait and see mode for all of the reasons that Ali was talking about. And remember, Ali had made mention, I would talk about very briefly the buy downs. Look at the lower left side of this graphic. They're not cheap, but this will get people off the fence when you can lock somebody in at 4.5. And some of our biggest public builders are doing that, and it's working, but it's not cheap. Now, affordability, that the challenges are out there. You saw Ali look at it from a different angle. There's, quite frankly, hesitancy. I don't want to beat this dead horse, but it's hesitancy. You heard Ali use the term compelling. That's our challenge from product. You heard me just now talk about buy downs. That's the challenge in affordability. The whole goal is to ultimately get that buyer off the fence, and we've got to be compelling about it. Now, when you generally look at prices, and you guys have been with us for almost 3 years now, and we used to be talking about price increases and pretty significant ones across the board. We're basically not seeing price increases now. And when you think about the percentage of builders that are reporting the drops by region, the Southeast has the highest percentage. Now, notice Ali was also talking about that market possibly being one of the most solid. So I think the correlation between those two are very important. But what happens when a builder cuts prices? And we're asking that question because it's one thing if prices reduce, but if we don't get a sale out of it, then it was really all for naught. So notice that we're not seeing an uptick in prices. But the key thing here is, what are you cutting the prices by? If it's a 1% or a 2%, $3,000 decrease on a $600,000 home, that's not going to move the needle. We've seen some of the public builders have great success with 10 and 15% cuts, and then we see pretty significant sales. Now, the cancellation rate, which is our big bugaboo, which is feeding into the standing inventory or quick move-ins, when we have asked builders about what their can rates are, they've actually reduced a little bit month over month. Now, I would attribute part of that to the fact that we were asking the question in November and December, and there was a slowdown in the market. But overall, why buyers are canceling. They're scared, there's affordability challenges, or they have trouble selling their home and potentially found a better deal elsewhere. No surprises there. Now, QMIs are vital. I mean, we always have to have them. And if you remember back to late 2020 and early 2021, we didn't have enough product on the ground for relocation buyers or people that were moving from one place to another or retiring. Now, when we ask the builders how comfortable they are with their QMIs, about 45% are in that place where they're a little uncomfortable or it's worrisome. We're going to continue to track that, but it's different in every market too, because if we've got sales moving, QMI are much less of a challenge. Now, if you've got QMI, what do you do about it? What are the options? Well, we've asked the builders, are you selling homes to investors? And almost half of them are saying yes, at least in a once-off. A small percentage, 5% are selling in bulk sale. The remaining percentage are not yet, but I think they are thinking about it. Now, we've also asked, what's your attitude about lots? Are you considering selling finished lots to investors? And for the most part, 60% are saying no. 30% yes, and a small percentage are saying, well, we're going to see how the market progresses. We'll keep our eyes on that one because I think we might see that percentage increase if the market doesn't improve appreciably over the next 2 quarters. Affordability, the big A, affordability and the new loan limits. Now, this is a vital thing, and Ali pointed this out to me. I really hadn't recognized it, that this reflects our annual survey of millennials. It's well over 1,000 millennials. It's statistically significant, but look at that left-hand side. 33% of respondents said that they're ready to buy within the next 1 to 3 years. That's the highest it's been in 7 years. That's an important takeaway. That's the highest it's been in 7 years. Now, importantly, we have to keep in mind want versus can, because there's other elements here related to interest rates up and prices up. So I'm going to pause for a second. On the left-hand side, we've tracked in each of these markets the entry-level price appreciation in just 1 year. Now, keep in mind that looks at year-end 2022 to year-end 2021. Now, those numbers are pretty significant. And then when you look at the absolute pricing, 2019 to current, you can see a pretty significant change. And look at some of the percentages. I think that percentage ranges from about 21 to 50%. That goes back to my challenge of can versus want. With these higher prices, it's a little bit more difficult for affordability to kick in. Now, there has been some help. And when you look at the share of projects that are under $300,000, this is a vital thing for us to think about, because you're not going to find under 300,000 in San Diego, for instance. But when you look at these markets, this is the true entry level. And many of these markets, look at the right-hand side, it's really the dodo bird. You don't see many projects with homes priced under 300,000. Now we've looked at contracts. So notice the left-hand side are subdivisions. The right-hand side are contracts. So homes actually in contract. And you can see the incredible shift that's happened from 2019 to 2022. And here's your takeaway. There's not many. And not that we're saying you have to have $300,000 as a price point, but we're looking at that lower average selling price for a market to really move. And ultimately, how do we battle it? And Allie, I want you to know, I tried to come up with an acronym, kind of like FOBAT, fear of buying at the top, with the changes with home prices, size, finishes, options, locations. And it was like PSFLOM or FLUSSIMums or MFLOPs. It didn't work. So just know the levers we have to pull are price and home size, finish options, location, material costs, like Tom was asking us about. And those are the ways that we're going to battle our ways back to this market. Now, the conventional loans and cash buyers have gained share. FHA share has decreased, but it's important to note that conventional loans include some of the jumbos and the like. But the key factor that we're paying attention to is, ultimately, we need a low down payment option. And when we ask people where their source of down payment comes from, look at the percentage of cash savings. By the way, I think another way of saying that is the bank of mom and dad. But also, as we look market by market and how much people are putting down, you can see from less than 3% to all cash. That's the blue color. It's primarily in that realm of 3 to 20%, with probably 11 to 20% being most common. And that gets away from PMI. But you can see the shift has been similar. The absolute numbers are a little bit different market by market. Now, we have new loan limits, and they're trying to keep pace with HPA. And keep in mind, I want you to focus on the 2023 conforming numbers, and then look to the right and look at 2023 FHA. Notice in some markets they're identical, other markets are a little bit different. But the important thing is you start to track this, you'll see that the really expensive markets, LA, New York, San Francisco, DC, they're above $1 million in both the conforming and the FHA numbers. Look towards the bottom where we are with Tampa and Charlotte and Indy. The numbers are a little bit different when we look at FHA versus conforming, and those markets are certainly the more affordable side. Let's look at it graphically. The left-hand side of this is going to give you additional projects under the 2023 FHA limit. So when you look at the price that I just shared with you, this is the number of products in each market. These are number of subdivisions, I should say, in each market that are under that price. Now, this just bumped up a little bit because we've seen those prices be increased for FHA. Now, when we look at conforming, a similar thing happens. We've got an increase in the number, but look at, it's really Arizona and Texas that have had the biggest advantage here, but California's had a little bit of a benefit too. So keep your eyes on both of those, but this is helping the market at least marginally. Now, a couple of housing trends, and if you had a chance to see Allie's article, builderonline.com, we were talking about interesting markets, and I struggle with this a little bit because I desperately want to call these the more resilient markets. But the reason we use the term and kind of hedge a little bit with interesting is that there are some lingering questions about each of these markets. But personally, I would call all of these markets pretty darn good places. So you can maybe scratch off interesting and put in pretty darn good. But here's how we tested it. We looked at rent versus own and that math, the percentage of homes that are mortgage free, the number of new home projects under 300,000, which in San Diego County, I think is 0, and the change in typical payments since the start of 2023. This is where some of those lingering questions come in, but high job growth potential. So just keep an eye on this. It's one of the things that we like to pay attention to simply because not every market is created equal. Now, if you're familiar with Simon Sinek, one of the things that he talks about, the motivation for anything is to define the why. And we've asked the question of the Millennial Survey, why did you decide to buy? What drove you? And when you look at the answers, those first couple have to do with building wealth and life stage changes. And there's others too, life stage flexibility, I want what's mine, but it really comes back to wealth and life stage changes. And then every decision that's made is not always a financial one, because look at some of the reasons for why people left. Sure, certainly want a larger home, wanted a more desirable neighborhood. I want to get rid of my crappy roommates. Oh, wait, that one's not on here. And reduce housing costs. I mean, there's a whole bunch of motivations, and our builder clients are doing their best to understand those factors, because that's the why, and that's what ultimately drives people to move. Now, we see builders that are aligning starts with sales, and this is the good news, because builders are responding pretty quickly. And the way to just look at this is focused on the left-hand side of this graphic. And about 58% of the builders are anticipating starts activity down between 11 and 30% or more in 2023. And well, it should be because of our QMI. But remember, it's not the same in every market. Look at the right-hand side. We still have a few markets that are anticipating up a little bit. Now, it's not the majority of the markets, but if you are in the Southeast, if you are in Cincinnati, maybe you're going to be able to weather the storm a little bit better. And then a similar factor is we're talking to builders. What do you think about your land strategy? And there is one word that I'd summarize all of this with, and that's cautious. But look at the pausing on deals. I think if you think about builders doing 3 basic steps, the really well-defined close-in product that has a 2020 land value, they're working on it. On the first ring, but they maybe locked it up in the last 2 years, they're renegotiating. For the stuff that's on the outskirts, they're probably going to walk and reevaluate and revisit in the next year or 2. Most builders are akin to some type of land strategy that has to do with that. And importantly, we're asking about staffing, because you heard Ali talking about what's happened in the tech industry, and from the home building side, we're watching it very, very closely. For the most part, we haven't seen massive layoffs, but I think if you look at your own organization, whether you're a building product manufacturer, a capital source, or a home builder, there's been some type of right sizing. But look at the right-hand side of this graphic. As of December, little over 50% of the respondents said, we really don't plan to this year. Now, what I'm hoping for is they were thinking about 2023, not answering for 2022 in December. But I think that's a fair bellwether of how the builders are looking at the world right now. Okay, a couple final thoughts. And very importantly, one of the things we try to do with final thoughts is bring up some crazy things, some interesting things, and some inspirational things. And the first one we want to share with you is that the French President Macron is looking at planting 1 billion, that's with a B, 1 billion trees during the next decade. The concept here is that there's been wildfires and there's been pestilence. And if they're able to do this and pull this off, it represents about 10% of the tree count in the country of France. And don't forget, it also helps the oxygen level. Secondarily, this is a weird one, but you've seen previously, if you've been with us for the last couple of years, I've included some concerns about plastic in the ocean and just our use of plastics worldwide. Well, waxworm saliva apparently can erode plastic waste. Who knew? And I bring this up just because there's more and more research being done with this, and it degrades the plastic and makes it ultimately reusable or just more environmentally friendly. Now, for those of you like me that were just absolutely taken with World Cup, do you remember the Japanese fans after their team had defeated Germany, and then even after they lost to Belgium, they cleaned the stadium? I was just blown away by that. And apparently it was their response saying, cleaning up is a way to demonstrate their pride in their way of life. So I started thinking about my own children. And if you clean, you have pride in the way of life. I'm going to have a conversation with my 3 kids about pride, that's for sure. Not the cleanest, I'll tell you. Now, fourth one, lab-grown blood. Now, this might seem strange, but the concept of being able to create lab-grown blood and use it for transfusions is really important for people that have had some of the challenges with anemia, sickle cell anemia, and it's a breakthrough that could save many lives. And kind of a curveball here, 86% of companies that join the biggest 4-day work week trial ever said they're likely to continue with the policy. I'd be curious to hear from you guys and how you feel about a 4-day work week. But I kind of like the idea of a 3-day weekend. It really plays. Now, last thing, 3D printed homes. Now, we've seen a lot about this, but the curveball on this one, which the University of Maine put together, it's a 3D printed home using recycled materials. I kind of like where we're going. I know we in the home building industry are a little bit behind the scenes. We're coming up with new building products and manufacturing processes, but this is a really interesting one for us to think about. So as always, we'll leave you with inspiration. And I think most of you heard about what happened here, but it's really what happened afterwards that is such a mind-blowing element. Of course, you were aware with the Buffalo Bills and Damar Hamlin and the fact that his heart stopped on the field. Effectively, he was gone for a little bit, and the trainers were able to bring him back. And I would attribute some of that to the power of prayer. I would attribute some of it to the fact that this gentleman was unbelievably strong. But the other part of it is he wakes up after being in a coma. First thing he says is, "Did we win?" And I think that kind of attitude is amazing. But there's a postscript here. Damar had a GoFundMe page going before he was injured, looking to get about $2,500 together for basically a toy drive for kids in Buffalo. After he was injured, the GoFundMe page ballooned to $9 million and counting. And now that Damar is back and not only among the living, but visited his team and back with his family, he's looking at bringing that money into sports and education into the Buffalo area. And to me, that is one of those factors that we went from a potential horrifying experience to something that is beneficial to so many people. So I give love to Damar. Number 3, beautiful plan. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are in a position to say thank you for being here. Triad, thank you guys very much. I want to say a shout out to Lowell and Lanny and Brad and Maria. Remember, they have the fastest lead times in the industry. And with that, we've gotten a bunch of questions today, ladies and gentlemen. We're at time, so Allie and I will do our very best to incorporate those into the next presentation. With that, stay safe. We'll talk to you soon. Reach out with questions. We appreciate you being with us. Thanks, everybody. Take care.